Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime series for sleeping. Let's go. The Zodiac Killer, California's most elusive predator. Northern California in the late 1960s was a region caught between two worlds. The Summer of Love had painted San Francisco as the epicenter of peace and counterculture. But beneath the veneer of flower power and free love, darker currents were beginning to surface. The optimism of the early decade was giving way to something more sinister. And nowhere would this transformation be more dramatically illustrated than in the reign of terror unleashed by a killer who would become known as the Zodiac. The nightmare began on a cold December evening in 1968 in the quiet town of Benicia, just northeast of San Francisco. David Faraday, 17 years old and a standout student at Vallejo High School, had taken his girlfriend Betty Lou Jensen on what should have been an innocent first date. They drove to a secluded lover's lane on Lake Herman Road, a spot where countless young couples had gone to share intimate moments away from the watchful eyes of parents and society. What happened next would shatter the illusion of safety that small-town America had clung to, even as the world seemed to be spinning out of control. At approximately 11:15 p.m., a figure approached the young couple's car. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, no apparent motive beyond a cold desire to kill. David was shot in the head at point-blank range. Betty Lou was found 30 feet from the car, having been shot 5 times in the back as she tried to flee. Detective Les Lundblad of the Solano County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene to find what would become a frustratingly familiar pattern. 2 young victims, killed without apparent reason, with virtually no physical evidence left behind. The killer had been methodical, almost surgical in his precision. He had struck quickly and vanished back into the night, leaving behind only questions and grief. The investigation into the Lake Herman Road murders proceeded slowly through the winter and into 1969. There were few leads to follow, and the case might have remained just another unsolved tragedy, if not for what happened 6 months later. On the night of July 4th, 1969, as America celebrated its independence with fireworks and barbecues, the killer struck again, this time at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Darlene Farron, 22 years old and recently married, had driven to the secluded park with Michael Mago, 19, to talk and enjoy each other's company. Like the previous victims, they were young and in love, seeking privacy in a world that offered little of it to teenagers and young adults. At approximately midnight, a car pulled up beside them, and the nightmare began anew. The killer approached their vehicle and opened fire without warning. Darlene died at the scene, but Michael survived, though severely wounded. His account of the attack would provide investigators with their first real description of the killer. A stocky white man, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with short brown hair. But it was what happened next that would transform this from a local crime story into a national obsession. 40 minutes after the shooting, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call that would chill everyone who heard it. The voice was calm, measured, and utterly without emotion as it delivered a message that would haunt law enforcement for decades. I want to report a double murder. If you will go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye. The caller hung up before police could respond, but his message was clear. They were dealing with a serial killer. Someone who was not only willing to kill strangers, but who wanted credit for his crimes. The investigation took on a new urgency as detectives realized they were hunting a predator who might strike again at any time. Detective Dave Tosky of the San Francisco Police Department joined the investigation as jurisdictional lines blurred, and it became clear that the killer was operating across county boundaries. Tosky was a meticulous investigator with an eye for detail and a determination that would drive him to work the case for years to come. But even his thoroughness would prove insufficient against an adversary who seemed to anticipate every move. 3 weeks after the Blue Rock Springs attack, the case entered a new and even more disturbing phase. 3 letters arrived simultaneously at 3 Bay Area newspapers: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each contained identical texts, written in a distinctive hand that would become as famous as any signature in criminal history. The letters began with a chilling declaration. Dear editor, I am the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman Road and the girl last 4th of July near the golf course in Vallejo. The writer went on to provide details about the crimes that only the killer could have known, establishing his authenticity beyond doubt. But it was the demand that accompanied these confessions that would capture the public's imagination and establish the killer's enduring notoriety. Each letter contained one-third of a cryptographic cipher, 408 symbols arranged in rows that the killer claimed contained his identity. He demanded that the newspapers publish the cipher on their front pages, threatening to go on a killing spree if his demands were not met. The threat was credible enough that all three papers complied, printing the strange symbols that looked like something from an ancient manuscript or an alien communication. The cipher publication marked the birth of the Zodiac Killer as a cultural phenomenon. Amateur codebreakers across the country attempted to solve the puzzle, while professional cryptographers at the FBI and National Security Agency applied their skills to the mysterious message. The killer had succeeded in making himself the center of national attention, transforming his crimes from local tragedies into a macabre entertainment that captivated millions. The cipher was cracked within a week by Donald and Betty Harden, a high school history teacher and his wife from Salinas, California. The decoded message was both disappointing and terrifying. "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest. Because man is the most dangerous animal of all to kill something, gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise. And all the they I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow down or atop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife ebioritimethpiti." The misspellings and grammatical errors were deliberate, investigators believed, part of the killer's attempt to disguise his true educational background and intelligence level. But the content was genuinely disturbing. Here was a killer who viewed his victims not as human beings, but as acquisitions for some twisted afterlife fantasy. The psychological profile that emerged was of someone who saw murder not just as entertainment, but as a form of spiritual preparation. On September 27, 1969, the Zodiac struck again, this time at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, both college students, were enjoying a peaceful afternoon by the lake when their tranquility was shattered by the appearance of a man wearing an executioner's hood, marked with the now familiar crosshairs symbol that had appeared on the Zodiac's letters. The Lake Berryessa attack was different from the previous shootings. The killer engaged his victims in conversation, binding them with rope before stabbing them repeatedly. Brian survived the attack and was able to provide detailed information about the killer's appearance and behavior. Cecilia died 2 days later from her wounds, but not before providing additional details to investigators. What made the Lake Berryessa attack particularly chilling was the killer's apparent enjoyment of the psychological torture he inflicted on his victims. He had talked to them calmly before the attack, almost conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than planning their deaths. After the stabbing, he had walked to their car and written the dates of his previous attacks on the door, along with the Zodiac symbol, claiming credit for his crimes in his own hand. Detective Toschi found himself increasingly obsessed with the case as the evidence mounted, but the killer remained as elusive as ever. The Zodiac seemed to understand police procedures and investigative techniques, always staying one step ahead of the massive manhunt that had developed. He left just enough evidence to taunt investigators, but never enough to lead them to his door. 2 weeks after the Lake Berryessa attack, the Zodiac struck again, this time in San Francisco itself. Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver and graduate student, was shot and killed in his taxi in the upscale Presidio Heights neighborhood. The killer tore off a piece of Stein's bloody shirt and disappeared into the night, but not before being seen by witnesses who provided the most detailed description yet of the Zodiac's appearance. 3 days after the Stein murder, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, this one containing a piece of the cab driver's shirt as proof of the killer's identity. The letter mocked the police investigation and claimed that officers had actually seen him leaving the scene, but had failed to recognize him as the killer they sought. The level of detail about the crime scene and the police response suggested that the Zodiac had remained in the area long enough to observe the investigation. The psychological profile of the Zodiac that emerged from years of investigation painted a picture of someone with above-average intelligence, possibly military training, and an intimate knowledge of the Bay Area's geography. He was likely employed, possibly in a technical field, and able to blend into normal society while harboring his violent fantasies. But despite the profile and the massive resources devoted to the case, he remained a ghost. The letters continued to arrive sporadically over the next several years, each one adding to the killer's mythology while providing frustratingly few concrete clues. The Zodiac claimed responsibility for dozens of murders across California, though investigators were able to definitively link him to only 5 deaths. He sent cryptograms that remained unsolved for decades, taunting codebreakers and conspiracy theorists who saw hidden meanings in every symbol. One of the most famous communications was a letter sent to the Chronicle in 1969 that began with the now iconic phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." The letter contained threats against school children and detailed the killer's plans for future attacks. It demonstrated not only his willingness to kill, but his desire to create maximum fear and disruption in the community. Detective Toski worked the case with an intensity that eventually consumed his professional life. He followed thousands of leads, interviewed countless suspects, and developed theories that ranged from plausible to fantastic. The case files grew to enormous proportions, but the killer remained as elusive as ever. Other investigators joined the hunt, retired, and were replaced, but the Zodiac files continued to grow without resolution. The investigation was hampered by jurisdictional disputes between different law enforcement agencies and by the killer's apparent understanding of police procedures. He struck in different counties using different methods and left evidence that suggested careful planning and preparation. Each crime scene was thoroughly processed, but the killer had been careful to avoid leaving fingerprints or other identifying traces. Public fascination with the case grew with each new letter and threat. The Zodiac had succeeded in creating a brand of terror that transcended his actual crimes. Movies, books, and television shows were produced about the case, often taking dramatic liberties with the facts but keeping the killer's name in the public consciousness. He had achieved the immortality he seemed to crave. The letters began to taper off in the mid-1970s, and investigators were never certain whether the Zodiac had stopped killing, moved away, died, or simply lost interest in taunting law enforcement. The case remained officially open, with new detectives periodically reviewing the evidence and following up on tips that continued to pour in from around the country. DNA evidence unavailable during the original investigation was later applied to some of the physical evidence, but the results were inconclusive. The killer had been careful about what he touched, and the passage of time had degraded much of the biological evidence. Advanced techniques continued to be applied as technology improved, but the Zodiac's identity remained a mystery. Arthur Lee Allen, a former elementary school teacher from Vallejo, emerged as the most promising suspect in the case. His background, behavior, and circumstantial connections to the crimes made him a person of interest for years. But investigators were never able to develop enough evidence to charge him. Allen died in 1992, taking whatever secrets he might have possessed to his grave. The case attracted amateur investigators, conspiracy theorists, and armchair detectives who developed elaborate theories about the killer's identity and motivation. Online forums dedicated to the Zodiac case attracted thousands of participants who analyzed every letter, symbol, and piece of evidence. Some claimed to have solved the case, but none of their solutions satisfied law enforcement or stood up to rigorous scrutiny. In 2020, a team of amateur codebreakers finally solved the Zodiac's 340-character cipher that had remained unbroken for 51 years. The decoded message was typically taunting. "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show," which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death. The solution of the 340 cipher brought renewed attention to the case, but provided no new leads about the killer's identity. It was another taunt from beyond the decades, a reminder that the Zodiac had succeeded in creating an enduring mystery that might never be solved. The misspellings and strange phrasing were consistent with previous communications, confirming their authenticity but providing no new insights into the killer's psychology or background. Today, more than 50 years after the first Zodiac attack, the case remains one of America's most famous unsolved serial killer cases. The files continue to be reviewed by new generations of investigators, and tips still arrive regularly from people who believe they have information about the killer's identity. But the Zodiac's greatest achievement may have been his ability to vanish so completely that even decades of investigation and technological advancement have failed to unmask him. The victims of the Zodiac killer deserve to be remembered not just as entries in a famous case file, but as young people whose lives were cut short by a predator who saw them only as objects for his twisted fantasies. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein. Their names should be spoken with the same frequency as their killers, their dreams and aspirations remembered alongside the investigation that failed to bring their killer to justice. The Zodiac case represents both the best and worst of American criminal investigation. It showcased the dedication of detectives like Dave Toschi, who devoted years of their lives to seeking justice. But it also demonstrated the limitations of law enforcement when faced with a careful, intelligent adversary who understood how to exploit the system's weaknesses. The killer's ability to vanish so completely serves as a reminder that some mysteries may never be solved, no matter how much time and resources are devoted to solving them. Story 2. BTK, the family man who lived a double life. Wichita, Kansas in the early 1970s was the embodiment of Middle America, a place where neighbors knew each other's names, where children played in the streets until the streetlights came on, and where families felt secure behind unlocked doors. It was a community that prided itself on traditional values and simple living, far removed from the urban chaos that seemed to plague America's larger cities. But beneath this veneer of suburban tranquility, a darkness was growing, one that would shatter the community's sense of safety and reveal that evil could wear the most ordinary of faces. The nightmare began on January 15, 1974, with the Otero family. Joseph Otero, a 38-year-old Air Force veteran, lived with his wife Julie and their children in a modest ranch home on Edgemore Street. It was a Tuesday morning like any other, with Joseph preparing for work at the Coleman Company and Julie getting ready to take their youngest children to school. Their older children, 15-year-old Joseph II and 11-year-old Josephine, had stayed home that day, a decision that would prove tragically fatal. What happened in the Otero home that morning would become the stuff of nightmares. An intruder had entered through the back door, armed with a gun and carrying rope and other implements that suggested this was no random burglary. The killer methodically went through the house, restraining each family member before systematically murdering them. Joseph and Julie were strangled, young Joseph II was found hanging in the basement, and little Josephine was discovered in her bedroom, also strangled. Detective Bernie Drowatsky of the Wichita Police Department had investigated his share of homicides, but nothing had prepared him for the scene at 803 Edgemore. The killer had taken his time, showing a level of premeditation and sadistic pleasure that was almost incomprehensible. Personal items had been stolen, but this was clearly no robbery gone wrong. The positioning of the bodies, the evidence of prolonged torture, and the sexual nature of some of the violence pointed to something far more disturbing. The investigation into the Otero murders consumed the Wichita Police Department. Every lead was followed, every neighbor interviewed, every piece of evidence carefully cataloged. The killer had left behind few clues, some footprints, evidence of his method of entry, and a crime scene that spoke to a level of planning and preparation that chilled even experienced investigators. But most disturbing of all was the realization that whoever had done this had enjoyed it. For months, the case remained at the forefront of the department's priorities. But leads gradually dried up, and other crimes demanded attention. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated, if horrific, tragedy, if not for what happened 9 months later. On April 4, 1974, 21-year-old Catherine Bright and her 19-year-old brother Kevin returned to Catherine's apartment to find an intruder waiting for them. The attack on the Bright siblings followed a similar pattern to the Otero murders, but with a crucial difference. Kevin survived. Despite being shot twice, he managed to escape and alert police, providing them with the first eyewitness account of the killer. His description was frustratingly general, a white male of average height and build, but it confirmed that they were dealing with someone who was capable of controlling multiple victims simultaneously. Catherine Bright died from multiple gunshot and stab wounds, her life cut short by a predator who seemed to select his victims at random. The connection between her murder and the Otero killings wasn't immediately apparent to investigators, but the methodical nature of both crimes and certain signature elements began to paint a disturbing picture of a serial killer operating in their midst. The investigation took on new urgency as Detective Jawotsky and his colleagues realized they were hunting someone who was not only willing to kill entire families, but who appeared to be escalating. The time between the Otero murders and the Bright attack suggested a killer who was becoming more confident, more willing to take risks, and more dangerous with each crime. What happened next would transform the case from a local investigation into a national sensation. In October 1974, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle newspaper that would chill everyone who read it. Written in crude block letters, the communication began with a phrase that would become infamous. "I write this letter to you for the sake of the taxpayer as well as your time. Those three dudes you have in custody are just talking to get publicity for the Otero murders. They know nothing at all. I did it by myself and with no one's help." The letter went on to provide details about the Otero murders that only the killer could have known, establishing its authenticity beyond doubt. But it was the signature that would give the killer his enduring nickname. "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. You see," he added again, "they will be on the next victim." BTK had announced himself to the world, transforming from an unknown killer into a branded predator who wanted recognition for his crimes. The letter demonstrated not only his willingness to kill, but his desire for attention and credit. He was playing a game with law enforcement and the media, using the Postal Service as his method of keeping score. The psychological profile that emerged from the letter and crime scenes painted a picture of someone with above-average intelligence who took meticulous care in planning his attacks. The killer was organized, patient, and capable of extraordinary self-control between crimes. He was likely employed, possibly married, and able to maintain a normal facade while harboring the darkest of impulses. Detective Jawotsky worked with FBI profilers to understand the mind of their quarry, but BTK remained frustratingly elusive. The killer seemed to understand police procedures and was careful about leaving evidence. His communication suggested someone who followed media coverage of his crimes closely, feeding off the attention and fear he was creating in the community. On March 17, 1977, BTK struck again, this time targeting 24-year-old Shirley Vian and her three children. The attack occurred in broad daylight while the children were home from school, demonstrating the killer's growing boldness and disregard for the possibility of witnesses. Shirley was strangled while her children were locked in a bathroom, traumatized but alive. The Vian murder showed evolution in BTK's methodology. He had learned from previous crimes, bringing his own restraints and tools rather than relying on materials found at the crime scene. The killer was becoming more efficient, more practiced, and more confident in his ability to control multiple victims simultaneously. 3 months later, BTK claimed his next victim. Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old secretary, was found strangled in her apartment on December 8, 1977. The killer had cut her phone lines before entering, showing his continuing evolution and adaptation. After the murder, he used a neighbor's phone to call police and report the crime himself, demonstrating an almost compulsive need for attention and control. The Fox murder was followed by another communication, this one even more detailed and disturbing than the first. BTK described his crimes in clinical detail, referring to his victims by number rather than name, and describing his methods with the detached tone of someone discussing a hobby rather than mass murder. The letter confirmed what investigators had feared. They were dealing with someone who saw killing not as an unfortunate necessity, but as entertainment. The investigation expanded to include multiple agencies as the case gained national attention. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit provided profiles and analysis, while local detectives followed thousands of leads. The killer's communications were analyzed by handwriting experts, psychiatrists, and linguists, but BTK remained as elusive as ever. What made the case particularly frustrating was BTK's apparent ability to vanish between crimes. Unlike other serial killers who struck frequently, BTK would commit a murder and then disappear for months or even years. His communications suggested that he was following the investigation closely, but he never made the kind of mistake that would lead investigators to his door. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw BTK enter what investigators would later call his cooling-off period. No new murders were attributed to him, and his communications became sporadic. Some investigators wondered if he had died, moved away, or been incarcerated for other crimes. But those who had studied his psychology suspected he was still out there, biding his time and planning his next move. The case remained active, but gradually moved to the back burner as other crimes demanded attention. Detective Drowatsky retired, passing the case files to a new generation of investigators who brought fresh eyes to the evidence. But despite advances in forensic science and investigative techniques, BTK remained a ghost, existing only in the letters he had sent and the crime scenes he had left behind. In 1985, BTK emerged from his long silence with a vengeance. Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old grandmother, was found strangled in her home on April 27th. The crime scene bore all the hallmarks of a BTK murder: the meticulous planning, the evidence of prolonged torture, and the sexual sadism that had become his signature. After years of quiet, the killer had returned. The Hedge murder was followed by another long silence, broken only occasionally by communications that seemed designed more to taunt investigators than to provide any useful information. BTK had evolved into something even more dangerous, a killer who struck rarely but with devastating effect, keeping an entire community on edge with the knowledge that he was still out there. Vicky Wiggerl became BTK's next confirmed victim on September 16, 1986. The 36-year-old mother was found strangled in her home, another life cut short by a predator who seemed to select his victims based on opportunity rather than any discernible pattern. The randomness of his target selection made it impossible for potential victims to protect themselves through behavioral changes. The investigation into BTK's crimes became one of the longest-running serial killer cases in American history. New detectives joined the task force, new technologies were applied to old evidence, and new theories were developed and discarded. But the killer remained as elusive as ever, existing somewhere in the sprawling suburbs of Wichita, living what appeared to be a normal life, while harboring memories of unthinkable violence. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr of the Wichita Police Department took over the BTK investigation in the 1990s and brought new energy to the cold case. Landwehr was convinced that BTK was still alive and still living in the Wichita area. He began a campaign of public outreach, appearing on television and in newspapers to keep the case in the public eye and encourage anyone with information to come forward. The strategy of keeping BTK in the public consciousness proved prescient. In 1991, the killer claimed another victim when he murdered Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old grandmother. The crime scene was consistent with previous BTK murders, but the long gap between killings suggested that the killer was exercising extraordinary self-control or was being restrained by other circumstances in his life. What investigators didn't know was that BTK was indeed living a double life that would have seemed impossible if it hadn't been documented. He was married with children, active in his church, and employed in positions that required public trust. He was, by all outward appearances, a model citizen who had somehow compartmentalized his homicidal impulses into a separate existence that never interfered with his public persona. The case remained cold for more than a decade until BTK made a fatal mistake. In 2004, apparently frustrated by renewed media attention on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, he began communicating with police and media outlets again. The communications were more frequent and more detailed than ever before, suggesting that the killer craved recognition and was willing to take risks to get it. BTK's downfall came through his own hubris and the advance of technology he didn't fully understand. In February 2005, he sent a floppy disk to a television station, asking in a previous letter whether such a disk could be traced back to him. When police told him through a newspaper ad that it couldn't be traced, he sent the disk, not realizing that deleted files could be recovered and metadata could reveal information about the computer used to create the files. The floppy disk led investigators to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita and to its congregation president, Dennis Rader. A comparison of DNA evidence from the crime scenes to DNA obtained from Rader's daughter's medical records confirmed what investigators could hardly believe. BTK was a 59-year-old compliance officer for Park City, Kansas, a husband and father who had been living a completely ordinary life while hiding the darkest of secrets. The arrest of Dennis Rader on February 25, 2005, ended one of the longest serial killer investigations in American history. The man who had terrorized Wichita for more than 30 years turned out to be someone who could have been anyone's neighbor, co-worker, or fellow church member. His ability to compartmentalize his crimes while maintaining a normal public life challenged everything investigators thought they knew about serial killers. Rader's confession revealed the true extent of his crimes and the meticulous planning that had gone into each attack. He had stalked his victims for weeks or months before striking, learning their routines and identifying the best opportunities to attack. He had kept detailed records of his crimes, including photographs and personal items taken from victims, treating his murders like a hobby he could revisit at will. The trial and sentencing of Dennis Rader provided some closure for the families of his victims, but it also raised disturbing questions about how someone could lead such a complete double life for so many years. His neighbors, co-workers, and fellow church members described him as unremarkable, sometimes annoying in his attention to rules and regulations, but never as someone capable of the violence he had committed. The BTK case became a landmark in criminal investigation, demonstrating both the power of modern forensic science and the importance of never giving up on cold cases. It also highlighted the reality that serial killers don't always fit the stereotypes portrayed in popular culture. Sometimes they are the most ordinary-seeming people in our communities, hiding their true nature behind masks of respectability and normalcy. For the survivors and families of BTK's victims, Rader's arrest brought an end to decades of uncertainty and fear, but it also forced them to confront the reality that the monster who had destroyed their lives was not some obvious predator, but rather someone who could have been anyone. A reminder that evil often wears the most mundane of faces, and that the capacity for violence can lurk behind even the most ordinary exterior. Today, Dennis Rader serves 10 consecutive life sentences in a Kansas prison, where he will remain until his death. His case continues to be studied by criminal psychologists and law enforcement professionals who seek to understand how someone can successfully compartmentalize such extreme violence while maintaining the facade of a normal, productive life. The lessons learned from the BTK investigation continue to influence how police approach serial killer cases and cold case investigations. Story 3, The Angel of Death, Donald Harvey's Silent Reign of Terror. In the quiet corridors of American hospitals during the 1970s and 1980s, a figure moved through the shadows of the night shift, carrying with him not healing hands, but instruments of death. This is the story of Donald Harvey, a man who would become known as one of America's most prolific serial killers, claiming the lives of at least 37 people, though he confessed to killing 87. Unlike the sensationalized cases that dominate true crime discussions, Harvey's story is one of calculated patience, institutional trust, and the terrifying reality that sometimes the very people we depend on for our lives can become our greatest threat. Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952, in Butler County, Ohio, into a family that seemed ordinary on the surface. His childhood, however, was marked by dysfunction and abuse that would later be examined by psychologists trying to understand how a man could systematically end lives while maintaining the facade of a caring healthcare worker. As a young man, Harvey showed an unusual fascination with death and dying. He would later tell investigators that he felt powerful when he watched life leave someone's body, describing it as a godlike feeling that became addictive. This psychological profile would become crucial in understanding his methodology and motivation. In 1970, at the age of 18, Harvey began working as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. It was here that his deadly career would begin, though it would be years before anyone suspected that the soft-spoken, seemingly dedicated worker was systematically murdering patients. Healthcare facilities provided Harvey with the perfect hunting ground. Patients were vulnerable, already ill, and deaths in hospitals, while tragic, were not unusual. Harvey understood this dynamic perfectly and exploited it with chilling efficiency. His methods were varied and sophisticated. Sometimes he would inject patients with insulin, causing fatal diabetic shock. Other times he used cleaning solutions or rat poison, substances readily available in the hospital environment. He even resorted to more direct methods when the opportunity arose, such as suffocation or disconnecting life support equipment. What made Harvey particularly dangerous was his patience and his ability to read situations. He would wait for moments when he wouldn't be observed, often during night shifts when staffing was minimal. He chose victims who were already critically ill, making their deaths appear natural and expected. The psychological aspect of Harvey's crimes was perhaps most disturbing. He didn't kill in fits of rage or passion, but with a cold calculation that suggested a complete lack of empathy for human suffering. He would later describe feeling excitement and a sense of power when taking lives, emotions that drove him to continue killing for nearly 2 decades. At Marymount Hospital, Harvey's killing spree began almost immediately. His first confirmed victim was a stroke patient whom he suffocated with a pillow. The death was attributed to complications from the stroke, and no suspicion fell on the young orderly who had been alone with the patient. This success emboldened Harvey. Over the next several months, he killed at least a dozen more patients using various methods. Each death was carefully orchestrated to appear natural, and Harvey's performance as a grieving, concerned healthcare worker was convincing enough to deflect any suspicion. The hospital environment worked in Harvey's favor in multiple ways. Not only did it provide access to vulnerable victims, but it also gave him knowledge of medical procedures and medications that he could use to cause death while mimicking natural causes. His position as an orderly meant he had access to patient rooms during quiet hours, and his presence near dying patients was expected rather than suspicious. Harvey's psychological state during this period was complex. He would later describe feeling both powerful and helpful, claiming that he was ending the suffering of terminally ill patients. This rationalization allowed him to continue killing while maintaining his self-image as a caring person. However, his victim selection suggests this was merely a convenient justification for his actions, as many of his victims were not terminally ill. In 1971, Harvey left Marymount Hospital and eventually found work at the Cincinnati Veterans Administration Medical Center. This move marked a significant escalation in his criminal activity. The VA hospital was larger, busier, and provided even more opportunities for Harvey to kill without detection. At the VA hospital, Harvey refined his methods further. He became particularly skilled at using medications to cause fatal reactions. He would inject patients with insulin, causing severe hypoglycemic shock that often proved fatal. He also used digoxin, a heart medication that could cause fatal arrhythmias when administered in large doses. Harvey's knowledge of medications and their effects grew sophisticated during his time at the VA hospital. He understood which substances would be difficult to detect in post-mortem examinations and which would produce symptoms that could be attributed to natural causes. This medical knowledge, combined with his position of trust, made him an exceptionally dangerous killer. The psychological dynamics at play during Harvey's time at the VA hospital were particularly troubling. He developed relationships with patients and their families, often comforting them during difficult times while simultaneously planning their deaths. This dual existence required a level of psychological compartmentalization that suggests a profound disconnect from normal human empathy. Harvey's killing spree continued unchecked for years, partly because the healthcare system of the 1970s and 1980s lacked many of the oversight mechanisms that exist today. Death rates were not systematically monitored for patterns, and the correlation between Harvey's presence and patient deaths went unnoticed by administrators. During his time at various healthcare facilities, Harvey killed patients using an increasingly diverse array of methods. He became particularly fond of using household cleaning products, which he would inject into patients' IV lines. The caustic nature of these substances would cause severe internal damage that often appeared to be the result of natural disease processes. Harvey also experimented with suffocation methods, sometimes using plastic bags or simply pressing pillows over patients' faces. These deaths were typically attributed to respiratory failure related to underlying conditions, and the physical evidence of suffocation was often obscured by the patient's existing medical problems. The psychological toll of Harvey's crimes extended beyond his immediate victims to their families and the healthcare workers who trusted him. Families mourning the loss of loved ones had no idea that their grief was the result of deliberate murder rather than natural causes. Nurses and doctors who worked alongside Harvey never suspected that their colleague was systematically killing the patients they were trying to save. Throughout his killing spree, Harvey maintained the facade of a dedicated healthcare worker. He was generally well-liked by colleagues and was often praised for his compassion toward patients and their families. This reputation provided him with perfect cover for his criminal activities and made it virtually impossible for anyone to suspect his true nature. Harvey's ability to maintain this deception was rooted in his understanding of human psychology and institutional dynamics. He knew that healthcare workers wanted to believe in each other's dedication to helping patients, and he exploited this trust ruthlessly. He would often volunteer for difficult assignments and showed up reliably for work, creating an image of dedication that masked his deadly intentions. The institutional culture of hospitals during this period also worked in Harvey's favor. Healthcare facilities were hierarchical organizations where questioning a colleague's actions was discouraged unless there was clear evidence of wrongdoing. Harvey's careful method selection and victim choice meant that such evidence was rarely apparent, allowing him to continue killing with impunity. Harvey's personal life during this period was also carefully managed to support his public image. He maintained friendships and romantic relationships, though those close to him would later describe subtle signs of his true nature that they had dismissed at the time. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining normal social relationships demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that made him particularly dangerous. Harvey's reign of terror might have continued indefinitely if not for a series of coincidences and one observing colleague. In 1986, while working at Drake Memorial Hospital in Cincinnati, Harvey made a crucial mistake that would begin to unravel his carefully constructed facade. A nurse noticed an unusual pattern in patient deaths during Harvey's shifts. While individual deaths could be explained by the patient's conditions, the statistical clustering was suspicious enough to warrant investigation. This nurse, whose identity was initially kept confidential for safety reasons, deserves credit for having the courage to report her suspicions, despite the potential professional and personal consequences. The investigation that followed was painstaking and required investigators to examine years of hospital records, death certificates, and staffing schedules. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Deaths occurred at a significantly higher rate when Harvey was working, and many of these deaths involved patients who had been expected to recover or who had died unexpectedly quickly. Harvey's response to the initial investigation was characteristic of his manipulative nature. He attempted to deflect suspicion by suggesting that the statistical correlation was coincidental and that he had simply been assigned to work with the sickest patients. He also tried to portray himself as a scapegoat, claiming that hospital administrators were looking for someone to blame for their high mortality rates. As investigators delved deeper into Harvey's background, they discovered a trail of suspicious deaths spanning multiple hospitals and nearly 2 decades. The scope of the investigation expanded dramatically as detectives contacted previous employers and examined records from facilities where Harvey had worked. The forensic challenges were immense. Many of Harvey's victims had been cremated, making toxicological analysis impossible. Others had been buried years earlier, and obtaining exhumation orders required substantial legal hurdles. However, investigators were able to identify several cases where tissue samples had been preserved, and these samples would prove crucial to building a case against Harvey. The psychological pressure on Harvey during this period was intense. For the first time in his criminal career, he was facing serious scrutiny of his actions. However, rather than confessing immediately, Harvey initially maintained his innocence and continued to work in healthcare facilities, potentially putting more lives at risk. The investigation team faced unique challenges in building their case. Unlike typical homicide investigations, where there is usually clear evidence of violence, Harvey's crimes were designed to mimic natural deaths. Investigators had to become experts in toxicology, hospital procedures, and medical record analysis to build a compelling case. In 1987, facing overwhelming evidence, Donald Harvey finally confessed to his crimes. However, his confession came with a twist that shocked even seasoned investigators. Harvey claimed to have killed not just the 37 victims that investigators had identified, but 87 people over the course of his career. Harvey's confession revealed the true scope of his crimes and provided insights into the mind of a serial killer who had operated successfully for nearly 2 decades. He described his methods in clinical detail, showing no remorse for his victims, but rather a pride in his ability to kill without detection. The confession process revealed Harvey's complex psychological makeup. He alternated between claiming to be a mercy killer who was ending suffering and admitting that he killed for the sense of power and control it gave him. This inconsistency suggested that his rationalizations were largely self-serving rather than genuine beliefs about the morality of his actions. The impact of Harvey's confession on the healthcare industry was profound. Hospitals across the country began implementing new oversight procedures, background check requirements, and monitoring systems designed to prevent similar crimes. The case became a catalyst for significant reforms in healthcare security and patient safety protocols. Harvey's trial was a media sensation, though it received less coverage than some other serial killer cases of the era. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including testimony from surviving victims who had experienced attempted murders, forensic evidence from exhumed bodies, and Harvey's own detailed confession. During the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of Harvey as a calculating predator who had exploited the trust placed in healthcare workers to satisfy his need for power and control. The defense attempted to argue that Harvey was mentally ill and that his actions were motivated by a misguided desire to end suffering, but these arguments were undermined by the evidence of Harvey's careful planning and victim selection. The testimony from families of Harvey's victims was particularly powerful. Many described the additional trauma of learning that their loved ones had been murdered rather than dying natural deaths. The violation of trust represented by Harvey's crimes added an extra layer of grief to their loss. Harvey was ultimately sentenced to multiple life terms, effectively ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm patients. His case became a landmark in criminal justice, establishing important precedents for prosecuting healthcare serial killers and highlighting the need for better oversight in medical facilities. The Donald Harvey case remains one of the most significant criminal cases in American healthcare history. His crimes highlighted vulnerabilities in the healthcare system that led to important reforms in patient safety, staff oversight, and death investigation procedures. The psychological profile developed during Harvey's case has become a reference point for understanding healthcare serial killers. His ability to maintain a facade of compassion while systematically killing patients demonstrated the sophisticated deception capabilities that such individuals can possess. Harvey's case also raised important questions about the healthcare system's ability to protect vulnerable patients. The fact that he was able to kill for nearly 2 decades without detection revealed significant gaps in oversight and monitoring that needed to be addressed to prevent similar crimes in the future. The story of Donald Harvey serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades. His crimes violated the fundamental trust that patients place in healthcare workers and challenged our assumptions about the people we depend on for our safety and well-being. Story 4. The Flamingo Motel Murders. A Florida true crime story. The summer of 1967 in Clearwater, Florida, was supposed to be nothing more than another season of tourists, beach parties, and the gentle hum of air conditioners working overtime against the oppressive humidity. But beneath the palm trees and pastel-colored motels that lined the Gulf Coast, something far more sinister was brewing, something that would shake the small beachside community to its core and leave investigators baffled for decades. The Flamingo Motel sat like a pink beacon on Gulf to Bay Boulevard, its neon sign flickering against the twilight sky each evening as travelers pulled into its shell-covered parking lot. Built in 1954, the single-story motor lodge had seen better days by the time the 1960s rolled around. The paint was peeling, the pool had a crack that leaked chlorinated water into the sandy soil, and the room smelled perpetually of cigarette smoke and sea salt. But for transient visitors and locals looking for a cheap place to conduct business, they'd rather keep private. The Flamingo served its purpose just fine. Martha Kellerman had been the night manager at the Flamingo for 3 years when she first noticed the pattern. It started with small things. Guests who checked in but never seemed to check out, cars left abandoned in the parking lot for days, and an unusual number of requests for rooms at the far end of the property, away from the main office. Martha was a shrewd woman in her 50s, with bottle blonde hair, teased high, and cat-eye glasses that she wore on a beaded chain around her neck. She'd seen plenty of strange behavior in her time at the motel, but something about the summer of '67 felt different. The first body was discovered on July 15, 1967, in room 127. The guest had registered under the name Robert Smith and paid cash for 3 nights. When housekeeping tried to enter the room on the fourth morning, they found the door chained from the inside. After maintenance broke the chain, they discovered what remained of Robert Smith, real name Robert Caldwell, a 34-year-old insurance salesman from Tampa, arranged in a peculiar position on the bed. His body was positioned as if he were sleeping peacefully, hands folded across his chest, but his face told a different story. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, and his mouth was frozen in what appeared to be a scream that never escaped. The Pinellas County Sheriff's Department initially treated it as a heart attack or stroke. Caldwell had no obvious injuries, no signs of struggle, and the room was locked from the inside. But the coroner's report would later reveal traces of an exotic plant toxin in his bloodstream, something called tetrodotoxin, typically found in certain species of pufferfish. The question that haunted investigators was simple. How does a man from Tampa end up poisoned with a marine neurotoxin in a seedy motel room? And why was he arranged so carefully after death? 3 weeks later, on August 6th, housekeeping found another body. This time it was Elena Vasquez, a 28-year-old cocktail waitress from Miami who'd been working the summer season at a nearby beach resort. She'd checked into room 134 under her real name. And like Caldwell, she was found positioned peacefully on the bed with her hands folded. But Elena's case was different. She'd clearly fought back. Her fingernails were broken, there were defensive wounds on her arms, and the room showed signs of a struggle. Yet somehow she too had ended up in that same peaceful pose, and she too had the same toxin in her system. The local newspapers began calling it the Sleeping Beauty Murders, a name that made Sheriff William Kowalski's blood boil. This wasn't some fairy tale. These were real people with real families, and someone was killing them in increasingly bold ways. The FBI was called in after the second body, and Agent Patricia Hawthorne arrived from the Tampa field office with a reputation for solving impossible cases and a personal interest in crimes that targeted women. Agent Hawthorne was a rarity in 1967, a female FBI agent who'd clawed her way up through the ranks in a male-dominated field. She was methodical, patient, and had an uncanny ability to see patterns that others missed. As she walked through the Flamingo Motel for the first time, she noticed something that the local investigators had overlooked. Both victims had been found in rooms that faced the bay rather than the Gulf. Both rooms had recently been repainted, and both had new locks installed within the past 6 months. The third murder happened on August 23rd, but this time the killer made a mistake. Dr. James Whitmore, a 45-year-old marine biologist from the University of South Florida, had checked into room 139 to conduct research on local fish populations. Unlike the previous victims, Dr. Whitmore was found alive. Barely. He was discovered in the same peaceful position, hands folded, but his heart was still beating. The toxin hadn't fully taken effect, and he was rushed to Clearwater General Hospital, where he remained in a coma for 6 days before finally awakening. Dr. Whitmore's survival changed everything. Through fragmented memories and hypnosis sessions, he was able to provide crucial details about his attacker. He remembered a woman with dark hair and a slight accent, possibly Hispanic or Mediterranean. She'd knocked on his door, claiming to be from the motel management, investigating a water leak. When he'd opened the door, she'd sprayed something in his face that smelled like flowers and made him feel dizzy almost immediately. The last thing he remembered was her voice, soft and melodic, telling him to sleep now like the others. The breakthrough came when Agent Hawthorne realized that all 3 victims had one thing in common. They were all alone. No wives, no girlfriends, no travel companions. They'd all paid cash, and they'd all requested rooms at the back of the property. Someone was specifically targeting isolated individuals who wouldn't be missed right away. Martha Kellerman finally came forward with information she'd been holding back. She'd been receiving cash payments from a woman who called herself Carmen to reserve specific rooms for certain guests. Carmen would call ahead, provide a name, and arrange for the guest to be placed in one of the bay-facing rooms. In exchange, Martha received $50 per arrangement, more than she made in a week at the motel. She'd assumed Carmen was running some kind of escort service, which wasn't unusual for the area. The investigation led to Carmen Delgado, a 31-year-old former nightclub performer who'd moved to the Tampa Bay area in 1965. Born in Cuba, she'd fled to Miami during the revolution with her family when she was a teenager. But Carmen wasn't just any performer. She was the daughter of a prominent Havana physician who'd specialized in tropical medicine and toxicology. She'd grown up learning about the healing and deadly properties of plants and marine life, knowledge that had served her well in her new profession. Carmen's apartment in St. Petersburg was a laboratory of death. Investigators found detailed notes about her victims, including their habits, their loneliness, and their financial situations. She'd been methodically targeting men who traveled alone for business, using a combination of tetrodotoxin extracted from pufferfish and a paralytic agent derived from a rare Caribbean plant. Her method was simple but effective. She'd pose as a motel employee, spray the victim with her toxin mixture, then wait for them to become paralyzed but conscious. In their final moments, she'd arrange them peacefully on the bed and whisper to them about their loneliness, their isolation, and how they'd finally found peace. But Carmen's motives weren't purely financial. Her father had been murdered by Castro's forces in 1961, and she'd watched her mother die of heartbreak 2 years later. She'd developed a deep hatred for men who abandoned their families, men who chose their careers over their wives and children, men who spent their nights in cheap motels instead of going home to the people who loved them. In her twisted logic, she was putting these men out of their misery, giving them the peace they couldn't find in their empty lives. The case took a darker turn when investigators discovered that Carmen had been keeping souvenirs from her victims, personal items that told the story of their loneliness. Robert Caldwell's wallet contained a photo of his ex-wife and daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 3 years. Elena Vasquez had been carrying a letter from her sick mother, begging her to come home to Miami. Dr. Whitmore's briefcase contained divorce papers he'd been avoiding signing for months. Carmen had been studying these people, learning their stories, and convincing herself that she was performing a mercy killing. But the FBI profiler who worked the case, Dr. Margaret Shaw, had a different theory. She believed Carmen was projecting her own trauma onto her victims, seeing in them the abandonment and isolation she'd felt when her family was torn apart in Cuba. The final confrontation came on September 12, 1967. Carmen had agreed to meet Martha Kellerman at the Flamingo Motel to discuss a new arrangement. Unknown to Carmen, the meeting was a trap. Agent Hawthorne and the local police were waiting in the adjacent rooms. But Carmen was smarter than they'd given her credit for. She arrived early before the police were fully in position, and she'd brought her toxin spray. The standoff lasted 3 hours. Carmen had taken Martha hostage in room 127, the same room where Robert Caldwell had died. She'd sprayed Martha with a small amount of her toxin mixture, just enough to keep her compliant but conscious. Through the motel room door, Carmen told Agent Hawthorne her story, explaining in detail how each victim had died and why they deserved their fate. The most chilling part of Carmen's confession was her description of her victims' final moments. She'd talk to them as they lay paralyzed, telling them about their families, their missed opportunities, their failures as husbands and fathers. She'd hold their hands as they died, whispering that they were finally free from their loneliness. In her mind, she was an angel of mercy, ending the suffering of men who were already dead inside. Agent Hawthorne tried to negotiate with Carmen, pointing out that Dr. Whitmore had survived, that her methods weren't foolproof, that her mission was flawed. But Carmen had already made her decision. She'd saved the last dose of her toxin for herself, and she'd already administered it before the police arrived. As she spoke through the door, her voice grew weaker, her words more slurred. The door to room 127 finally opened at 11:47 p.m. Police found Carmen Delgado arranged peacefully on the bed, her hands folded across her chest, her eyes closed as if sleeping. Martha Kellerman was found alive but traumatized, having watched Carmen's final moments up close. In her last minutes, Carmen had whispered to Martha about her father, about the loneliness that had consumed her life, and about how she'd finally found peace. The Flamingo Motel murders officially ended with Carmen's death, but the case left lasting scars on everyone involved. The motel was demolished in 1975, and the property now houses a small shopping center. Martha Kellerman never worked in the hospitality industry again, and she spent the rest of her life in therapy, trying to process what she'd witnessed. Dr. Whitmore recovered physically, but suffered from nightmares for years, always seeing Carmen's face in his dreams. Agent Hawthorne went on to become one of the FBI's most respected criminal profilers, but she never forgot the case that taught her how trauma could transform a person into something unrecognizable. She kept Carmen's case file on her desk for the remainder of her career, using it as a reminder that the line between victim and perpetrator was often thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The most haunting aspect of the Flamingo Motel murders wasn't the exotic toxin or the elaborate crime scenes. It was the realization that Carmen Delgado had been partially right about her victims. Each man she'd targeted had been struggling with loneliness, with failed relationships, with the weight of their own poor choices. They'd all been seeking something in those cheap motel rooms, something that had made them easy targets for a woman who saw their isolation as a death sentence. In the end, the Flamingo Motel murders became a cautionary tale about the dangers of loneliness in an increasingly disconnected world. Carmen Delgado had taken it upon herself to end the suffering of men she saw as already dead. But in doing so, she'd become the very thing she claimed to despise. Someone who abandoned their humanity in pursuit of a twisted sense of justice. The case remains one of the most psychologically complex criminal investigations in Florida history. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who believe they're saving their victims from themselves. Story 5. The Mysterious Case of the Somerton Man. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, the gentle waves of Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia, lapped against the shore as they had for countless years before. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand dunes that bordered this quiet stretch of coastline. It was here on this seemingly ordinary morning that a mystery would unfold that would captivate investigators, puzzle code breakers, and intrigue the public for more than 70 years. A couple taking their regular morning walk along the beach noticed something unusual near the seawall. At first glance, it appeared to be a man resting against the concrete barrier, his head tilted back as if gazing at the sky. But as they approached, they realized something was terribly wrong. The man was motionless, and his skin had an unnatural pallor that spoke of death rather than sleep. The police arrived within the hour, their boots crunching on the sand as they approached the scene. What they found was a well-dressed man, approximately 45 years old, wearing a quality suit that seemed oddly formal for a beach setting. His brown hair was neatly combed, and despite being found on a beach, there was no sand in his hair or on his clothes. It was as if he had been carefully placed there, positioned with an almost deliberate precision. The man's appearance was striking in its ordinariness. He was of medium build, clean-shaven, with no immediately obvious cause of death. There were no signs of violence, no wounds, no blood. His clothes were expensive and well-maintained. A white shirt, a red and blue tie, a brown suit jacket, and polished shoes. Everything about him suggested a man of means, someone who took care of his appearance and dressed with purpose. But it was what the investigators didn't find that made this case extraordinary. The man carried no identification whatsoever. His pockets contained only the most basic items: a pack of chewing gum, some matches, a metal comb, and a few coins. Most mysteriously, all the labels had been carefully removed from his clothing, not torn or damaged, but precisely cut away, as if someone had taken great care to eliminate any trace of where these items had been purchased. The post-mortem examination, conducted by Dr. John Barclay Bennett, revealed even more puzzling details. The man's physical condition was excellent. His muscles were well developed, his hands showed no signs of manual labor, and his feet were in remarkably good condition, suggesting he hadn't done much walking recently. His teeth were in perfect condition, with expensive dental work that would have been quite costly in 1948. Most intriguingly, the examination revealed that the man's spleen was 3 times larger than normal, and his liver showed signs of acute congestion. These findings, combined with the lack of any obvious cause of death, led Dr. Bennett to conclude that the man had likely died from poison, specifically a substance that left no trace in the body after death. As news of the mysterious death spread, the case began to capture the public imagination. Newspaper headlines proclaimed the discovery of the unknown man, and later, the Somerton Man, named after the beach where he was found. The Adelaide community was both fascinated and unsettled by the presence of this well-dressed stranger in their midst. The investigation that followed was thorough and methodical. Detective Sergeant Lionel Lean, the lead investigator, was a careful and experienced officer who understood that this was no ordinary case. He began by checking missing persons reports, not just locally, but across Australia and internationally. Photographs of the man were distributed to police forces, published in newspapers, and shown on early television broadcasts. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of people came forward, convinced they recognized the man. Some claimed he was a missing relative. Others insisted he was a former neighbor or colleague. Each lead was carefully investigated, but one by one they all led nowhere. The man's identity remained as mysterious as ever. Weeks passed, and the case seemed to be reaching a dead end. Then on January 14, 1949, more than a month after the body was discovered, a railway station attendant at Adelaide Railway Station made a crucial discovery. In the left luggage office, he found a brown suitcase that had been deposited there on November 30th, just one day before the man's body was found. The suitcase contained items that seemed to belong to the dead man, but they only deepened the mystery. Inside were clothes in the same style and quality as those found on the body, and once again, all the labels had been carefully removed. There was a laundry bag with the name Keene or possibly Keene written on it, and a tie identical to the one the man had been wearing. But perhaps most significantly, the suitcase contained a small piece of paper torn from a book with two words printed on it, Tamam Shud. These words, meaning "it is finished" in Persian, were from the final page of a collection of poems called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The paper had been torn from the book, suggesting that somewhere a copy of this book existed with its final page missing. The discovery of this clue led to one of the most remarkable developments in the case. The police issued a public appeal asking anyone who owned a copy of the Rubaiyat to check if their final page was missing. The response came from an unexpected source. A man who wished to remain anonymous came forward with a copy of the book that was indeed missing its final page. This book, published in 1948, had been found in the back seat of the man's car, which had been parked near Somerton Beach around the time of the discovery. The timing was too coincidental to ignore, and the book became a crucial piece of evidence in the case. But the book held more secrets than just the missing page. On the back cover, investigators found something that would add another layer to the mystery. A series of letters written in pencil, appearing to be some kind of code. The letters read Wergobabd on the first line, followed by Milau on the second line, then W2 Bimpanit P on the third line, Miliaboe Kasi on the fourth line, and finally Temsumsgab on the fifth line. The appearance of this code electrified the investigation. Here finally was something concrete to work with, a message that might reveal the identity of the dead man or explain the circumstances of his death. The code was immediately sent to military intelligence, naval intelligence, and code-breaking experts around the world. The response from the cryptographic community was swift and enthusiastic. Code breakers who had worked on wartime intelligence, mathematicians, and puzzle enthusiasts all turned their attention to these mysterious letters. Some believed it was a simple substitution cipher, others thought it might be a book code, and still others suggested it could be an abbreviation or acronym. Weeks turned into months and months into years, but the code resisted all attempts at decryption. Professional cryptographers declared it unsolvable with the available information. Some suggested it might not be a code at all, but rather random letters or abbreviations that had personal meaning only to the dead man. The investigation also revealed another intriguing detail. Inside the book, along with the code, was a telephone number. This number belonged to a woman living in the Adelaide suburb of Glenelg, not far from where the body was discovered. When questioned by police, the woman initially denied any knowledge of the case, but later admitted that she had known a man who might have been connected to the Somerton man. This woman, whose identity was protected by the police and who became known only as Justin, revealed that during World War II, she had given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man named Alfred Boxall. She had worked as a nurse and had met Boxall when he was a patient. Their relationship had been brief but significant, and when he was transferred to another location, she had given him the book as a farewell gift. The connection seemed promising, but when investigators tracked down Alfred Boxall, they found he was alive and well, still in possession of the book Justin had given him. Moreover, when shown photographs of the Somerton man, Boxall was certain he had never seen the man before. This development led investigators back to Justin, who agreed to view the body. Her reaction was notable. She appeared shocked and had to steady herself against a wall, but she maintained that she did not recognize the man. However, her visible distress suggested there might be more to her story than she was willing to reveal. The case began to take on elements of a spy thriller. The careful removal of all identifying labels, the mysterious code, the connection to a book of Persian poetry, and the man's apparent good health and expensive clothing all suggested someone living under an assumed identity. This was, after all, the early years of the Cold War, and Australia was not immune to the tensions and espionage activities that characterized this period. Some investigators theorized that the Somerton man might have been a Soviet spy, operating under deep cover in Australia. The theory gained credence when it was discovered that the man had unusually developed calf muscles, consistent with someone who had spent time in a ballet academy or similar institution, a common training ground for Soviet agents. The spy theory was further supported by the man's apparent knowledge of how to remove identifying information from his possessions and his choice of a classical Persian text as a means of concealing a message. The careful positioning of his body and the timing of his death also suggested someone with training in clandestine operations. However, other investigators remained skeptical of the espionage angle. They pointed out that the man's expensive dental work and well-maintained appearance were inconsistent with someone living under a false identity. Moreover, the lack of any obvious intelligence value in Adelaide made it an unlikely location for Soviet operations. As the investigation continued, more theories emerged. Some suggested the man was a victim of unrequited love, driven to suicide by a failed romance. The connection to the Rubaiyat, with its themes of mortality and the fleeting nature of life, seemed to support this interpretation. The phrase "tamam shud," it is finished, could be seen as a final statement from someone ending their life. Others theorized that the man was involved in some form of criminal activity, perhaps smuggling or fraud, and had been murdered by his associates. The careful removal of identifying information could have been intended to prevent his criminal connections from being discovered. The medical evidence, however, continued to point toward poisoning as the cause of death. Dr. Bennett's examination had revealed the enlarged spleen and liver congestion that were consistent with certain types of poison. The man's peaceful expression and relaxed position suggested he had died without struggle, which was consistent with a poison that acted quickly and painlessly. But what kind of poison could kill a man and then completely disappear from his system? In 1948, the science of toxicology was far less advanced than it is today. Many substances that we now know to be deadly were not detectable by the methods available at the time. Some experts suggested the man might have been poisoned with digitalis, a heart medication that can be lethal in large doses and was difficult to detect post-mortem. Years passed, and the case remained unsolved. The Somerton man was buried in Adelaide's West Terrace Cemetery, his grave marked with a simple headstone reading, "The Unknown Man." The inscription included a quote from the Rubaiyat: "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach." The mystery had become part of Adelaide's folklore, a story told and retold, each telling adding new theories and possibilities. The case experienced a resurgence of interest in the 1970s when amateur investigators began applying new techniques to the old evidence. Computer analysis of the mysterious code revealed some interesting patterns, but still no definitive solution. Some researchers suggested that the code might be an acrostic, with each line representing the first letters of phrases or sentences that had personal meaning to the dead man. In the 1980s, a new theory emerged when researchers discovered that the man's ear shape was extremely unusual. He had what is known as a simba conchae, a part of the ear that is typically smaller than another part called the cavum conchae. In the Somerton man, this relationship was reversed, a condition that occurs in only about 1 to 2% of the population. This distinctive feature became another tool in the search for his identity. The ear discovery led to renewed interest in the case and prompted investigators to look more closely at the photographs and evidence. They also began to explore the possibility that the man might have relatives living in Australia, people who might share his distinctive ear shape and other physical characteristics. The case also began to intersect with advances in genetic science. As DNA analysis became more sophisticated, there was hope that genetic material from the Somerton man's remains might eventually provide clues to his identity. However, the embalming process used in 1948 had degraded much of the useful genetic material, making this approach challenging. Despite these obstacles, the case continued to attract attention from researchers, journalists, and amateur detectives around the world. The combination of mystery, possible espionage, and unsolved codes created a perfect storm of intrigue that captured imaginations across generations. In recent years, new technologies have been applied to the case with renewed vigor. Advanced computer analysis has been used to examine the mysterious code, and facial reconstruction techniques have been employed to create more detailed images of what the man might have looked like in life. These efforts have generated new leads and theories, but the fundamental mystery remains unsolved. The Somerton man case represents one of Australia's most enduring mysteries, a puzzle that has resisted solution for more than 7 decades. It reminds us that even in our modern world, with all its technology and investigative techniques, some secrets remain hidden, some identities remain unknown, and some stories remain untold. The man who died on Somerton Beach on that December morning in 1948 took his secrets with him. Whether he was a spy, a lover, a criminal, or simply a man who wanted to disappear, his story continues to fascinate and perplex us. In death, he achieved a kind of immortality, becoming not just a mystery to be solved, but a symbol of the unknowable nature of human existence. As we consider his story, we are reminded that behind every mystery is a human being, someone who lived and loved and ultimately died in circumstances that remain forever shrouded in secrecy. The Somerton man, whoever he was, deserves to be remembered not just as a puzzle to be solved, but as a person whose life, however mysterious, had meaning and value. The waves continue to wash against Somerton Beach, just as they did on that morning in 1948. The mystery remains, waiting perhaps for new technology, new evidence, or simply new eyes to see what has been hidden for so long. Until then, the Somerton man rests in his grave, the keeper of secrets that may never be revealed, a reminder that some mysteries are destined to endure. Story 6, The Unabomber, America's most elusive domestic terrorist. For nearly 2 decades, a shadow figure haunted the American landscape, sending carefully crafted bombs through the mail to victims he had never met. His targets seemed random at first: university professors, airline executives, computer store owners. But beneath the apparent chaos lay a twisted philosophy that would eventually lead to one of the most intensive manhunts in FBI history. This is the story of Theodore John Kaczynski, the man who became known as the Unabomber, a brilliant mathematician turned domestic terrorist whose reign of terror lasted from 1978 to 1995, claiming 3 lives and injuring 23 others. It's a tale that explores the dangerous intersection of genius and madness, isolation and ideology, and the thin line between intellectual pursuit and violent extremism. Theodore Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to working-class Polish-American parents. From an early age, Ted displayed exceptional intellectual abilities that set him apart from his peers. His IQ was measured at 167, placing him in the genius category, and he showed particular aptitude for mathematics and logical reasoning. Ted's childhood was marked by academic excellence, but social isolation. He skipped 2 grades, entering high school at age 13, where his intellectual superiority became both a source of pride and a barrier to normal social development. Classmates remembered him as brilliant but aloof, more comfortable with abstract concepts than human relationships. His parents, Theodore Sr. and Wanda Kaczynski, recognized their son's exceptional abilities and encouraged his academic pursuits. However, they may not have fully understood the psychological toll that being perpetually younger and more intellectually advanced than his peers would take on the developing child. This early isolation would become a recurring theme throughout Kaczynski's life. The Kaczynski household valued intellectual achievement above social skills, a dynamic that reinforced Ted's natural tendency towards solitary pursuits. He spent countless hours reading, conducting small experiments, and developing the analytical thinking skills that would later make him both an accomplished academic and a methodical terrorist. During his teenage years, Kaczynski began to show signs of the antisocial tendencies that would later define his adult life. He had few friends and showed little interest in typical teenage activities. Instead, he immersed himself in advanced mathematics and began developing the philosophical frameworks that would eventually justify his violent actions. In 1958, at the age of 16, Kaczynski entered Harvard University on a scholarship. The transition to college life should have provided opportunities for intellectual stimulation and social growth, but instead, it deepened his sense of alienation and began a process of psychological deterioration that would continue for decades. At Harvard, Kaczynski excelled academically, majoring in mathematics and maintaining excellent grades. However, his social isolation intensified in an environment where he was surrounded by other highly intelligent individuals who seemed to navigate social situations with ease. He felt increasingly disconnected from his peers and began to develop a deep resentment toward modern society and its technological developments. Perhaps most significantly, during his sophomore year at Harvard, Kaczynski participated in a psychological experiment conducted by Professor Henry Murray. The experiment, which was part of a broader study on personality and stress responses, involved subjecting students to intense personal interrogations designed to attack their beliefs and values. For Kaczynski, who had already developed strong philosophical positions despite his young age, these sessions were particularly traumatic. The experiments involved having his personal essays and beliefs systematically dismantled and ridiculed by graduate students trained in psychological manipulation techniques. The sessions were recorded, and participants were later shown footage of their distressed responses. The psychological impact of these experiments on Kaczynski cannot be overstated. Already prone to social withdrawal and developing anti-establishment views, the experience of having his deepest beliefs attacked in a clinical setting appears to have accelerated his psychological deterioration. Some researchers have suggested that these experiments played a crucial role in shaping Kaczynski's later anti-technology philosophy and his methods of psychological warfare against his victims. The Harvard environment also exposed Kaczynski to radical political and philosophical ideas that were prevalent on college campuses during the late 1950s and early 1960s. He began reading extensively about primitivist philosophy, environmental concerns, and critiques of industrialized society. These ideas would later coalesce into the Anti-Technology Manifesto that would define his terrorist campaign. After graduating from Harvard in 1962, Kaczynski pursued graduate studies in mathematics at the University of Michigan. His doctoral dissertation, titled Boundary Functions, was considered groundbreaking work in the field of geometric function theory. The complexity and originality of his mathematical thinking impressed his professors and positioned him for a successful academic career. However, even as Kaczynski achieved academic recognition, his personal relationships continued to deteriorate. Fellow graduate students found him increasingly difficult to relate to, describing him as arrogant and contemptuous of those he considered intellectually inferior. He showed little interest in the collaborative aspects of academic life and preferred to work in isolation. Kaczynski's mathematical work during this period demonstrated the same meticulous attention to detail and logical precision that would later characterize his bombs. His ability to think through complex problems systematically and identify subtle patterns would prove crucial to his success as a terrorist who evaded capture for nearly 2 decades. In 1967, at the age of 25, Kaczynski completed his doctorate and was immediately recruited by the University of California at Berkeley to serve as an assistant professor of mathematics. This appointment represented the pinnacle of academic achievement for someone his age, and many colleagues predicted a brilliant career ahead of him. At Berkeley, Kaczynski's teaching style reflected his growing misanthropy. Students found his lectures technically proficient, but emotionally cold. He showed little patience for students who struggled with mathematical concepts and seemed to view teaching as an unwelcome distraction from his research. His office hours were sparsely attended, and he made little effort to engage with the broader university community. The late 1960s were a time of significant social upheaval, particularly on college campuses like Berkeley. The anti-war movement, civil rights activism, and counterculture revolution were all prominent features of campus life. However, rather than engaging with these movements, Kaczynski became increasingly withdrawn and contemptuous of what he saw as mob mentality and intellectual superficiality. In 1969, after only 2 years at Berkeley, Kaczynski made a decision that shocked his colleagues. He resigned from his prestigious position without explanation and essentially disappeared from academic life. This withdrawal from society marked the beginning of his transformation from accomplished mathematician to domestic terrorist. Kaczynski's decision to leave academia was not impulsive, but rather the culmination of years of growing disillusionment with modern society. He had become convinced that technological progress was fundamentally destructive to human freedom and dignity, and he could no longer participate in the academic industrial complex that he believed was accelerating this destruction. Initially, Kaczynski returned to his parents' home in Chicago, where his erratic behavior and radical views created tension within the family. He took a series of menial jobs, including a brief stint at a foam rubber factory where his brother David also worked. Even in these simple employment situations, Kaczynski's inability to relate to coworkers and his contempt for industrial processes became apparent. During this period, Kaczynski began developing the philosophical framework that would later be articulated in his manifesto. He read extensively about primitive societies, environmental degradation, and the psychological effects of industrialization. He became particularly influenced by Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society, which argued that technology had become autonomous and was reshaping human society in destructive ways. In 1971, using money he had saved from his academic career and a small inheritance, Kaczynski purchased a remote 1.4-acre plot of land near Lincoln, Montana. The property, which cost $2,100, became the site where he would build a primitive cabin and begin his transformation into the Unabomber. The Montana cabin represented Kaczynski's attempt to live according to his anti-technology philosophy. He built the structure himself using hand tools and salvage materials, creating a one-room shelter with no electricity, running water, or modern conveniences. He grew his own food, hunted rabbits and other small game, and attempted to live as self-sufficiently as possible. Kaczynski's life in the Montana wilderness was a deliberate rejection of modern society and its technological systems. The cabin he built was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with a sleeping loft and a small wood stove for heating and cooking. The structure was so well camouflaged and remote that visitors could pass within a few yards without noticing it. Living in such primitive conditions required considerable skill and determination. Kaczynski had to master traditional survival skills, from food preservation to weather prediction. He studied edible plants, learned to track animals, and developed the practical knowledge necessary to survive Montana's harsh winters without modern heating or food storage systems. However, the isolation that Kaczynski sought as an escape from technological society also accelerated his psychological deterioration. Years of minimal human contact, combined with his pre-existing antisocial tendencies, created a feedback loop of resentment and paranoia that would eventually manifest in violence. During the early years in Montana, Kaczynski maintained some connection to the outside world through occasional trips to town for supplies and irregular correspondence with his family. These interactions became increasingly strained as his appearance became more unkempt and his conversation more focused on his anti-technology theories. Kaczynski's daily routine in the wilderness was structured around survival activities and intellectual pursuits. He continued to read voraciously, focusing on works that supported his developing anti-industrial philosophy. He also began writing extensively, documenting his thoughts on technology, society, and human nature in journals that would later provide insight into his mental state during this period. The physical challenges of wilderness living seemed to energize Kaczynski in ways that academic life never had. He took pride in his ability to survive without the technological systems he despised, and saw his lifestyle as proof that alternatives to industrial society were possible. However, this pride was coupled with increasing anger toward those who, in his view, were too weak or corrupted to reject technological dependence. The transition from wilderness hermit to domestic terrorist was gradual and reflected Kaczynski's growing frustration with his inability to influence broader society through his personal example. He had hoped that his retreat from civilization would inspire others to question their dependence on technology, but the world continued its technological advancement without notice of his protest. Kaczynski's first bombing occurred on May 25, 1978, when a package bomb injured Northwestern University's security officer Terry Marker. The device, which was disguised as a package from a professor, exploded when Marker attempted to return it to the supposed sender. The bombing marked the beginning of a campaign that would span 17 years and terrorize American academia and industry. The choice of targets for Kaczynski's bombing campaign reflected his anti-technology philosophy, but also revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. Rather than focusing exclusively on major industrial or technological leaders, he often targeted individuals who represented what he saw as the broader corruption of natural human values by technological systems. The bombs themselves were masterpieces of primitive engineering that demonstrated Kaczynski's mathematical precision and his commitment to using pre-industrial methods whenever possible. He crafted each device by hand using materials that could be obtained without leaving obvious traces, and he designed them to maximize psychological impact as well as physical damage. Kaczynski's bombing methodology revealed his understanding of both explosives and psychology. The packages were often disguised as gifts or academic materials, exploiting the trust and curiosity of his victims. The devices were designed to detonate when opened, ensuring that the victim would be the person most directly harmed by his actions. In the early years of the bombing campaign, law enforcement struggled to identify patterns in what appeared to be random acts of violence. The targets seemed unconnected: university professors, airline executives, and computer specialists. However, as more bombs were discovered and detonated, investigators began to recognize the methodical intelligence behind the attacks. The FBI created a task force specifically dedicated to investigating these bombings, coining the term Unibomb, University and Airline Bomber, to describe the case. The investigation became one of the longest-running and most expensive in FBI history, eventually involving more than 150 full-time agents and thousands of interviews. Forensic analysis of the bombs revealed a maker with sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, electronics, and metalworking. The devices showed evidence of meticulous craftsmanship and innovative design features that demonstrated both technical skill and careful planning. Each bomb was unique, suggesting that the maker was constantly refining his techniques. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted a picture of an intelligent, methodical individual with a deep resentment toward modern society and its institutions. The profilers suggested that the bomber was likely highly educated, possibly with advanced degrees in technical fields, and had become increasingly isolated from mainstream society. Despite the growing sophistication of the investigation, Kaczynski remained elusive. His careful selection of materials, his remote location, and his minimal contact with the outside world made him nearly impossible to trace through conventional investigative methods. He seemed to understand law enforcement procedures well enough to avoid the mistakes that typically lead to capture. The bombings continued with irregular frequency, sometimes separated by months or even years. This unpredictable timing added to the psychological terror of the campaign, while also making it difficult for investigators to predict when and where the next attack might occur. Each new bombing brought renewed media attention and public anxiety about the identity and motives of the mysterious Unabomber. As the years passed, Kaczynski's bombs became more sophisticated and more deadly. The psychological satisfaction he derived from the bombing seemed to require increasing levels of violence and public attention. What had begun as attacks designed to injure and terrorize evolved into a campaign capable of killing. On December 11, 1985, Hugh Scruton, owner of a computer rental store in Sacramento, California, became Kaczynski's first murder victim when a bomb hidden in the parking lot behind his store exploded as he moved it. Scruton's death marked a significant escalation in the Unabomber's campaign and demonstrated that the bomber had moved beyond attempts to injure and terrorize to deliberate homicide. The murder of Hugh Scruton had a profound impact on the investigation and on public perception of the Unabomber. What had previously been viewed as the work of a dangerous but perhaps mentally ill individual was now clearly recognized as the campaign of a calculating killer willing to take lives to advance his ideology. Kaczynski's second murder occurred on February 20, 1987, when Gary Wright, owner of a computer store in Salt Lake City, was killed by a bomb placed in his store's parking lot. The device was designed to look like a piece of lumber with nails protruding from it, exploiting Wright's natural inclination to remove what appeared to be debris from his property. The killing of Thomas Mosser on December 10, 1994, represented perhaps the most psychologically calculated murder in Kaczynski's campaign. Mosser, an advertising executive, was killed by a bomb mailed to his home in New Jersey. The attack occurred during the holiday season and was opened by Mosser in the presence of his family, maximizing the psychological trauma of the event. Each murder demonstrated Kaczynski's growing sophistication in both bomb-making and victim selection. He had learned to maximize both the physical damage and psychological impact of his attacks while minimizing his own risk of detection. The bombs were designed to kill specific individuals while sending broader messages about the dangers of technological society. By the mid-1990s, Kaczynski had become frustrated with the limited impact of his bombing campaign. While his attacks had generated considerable media attention and law enforcement resources, they had not sparked the broader anti-technology revolution he had hoped to inspire. This frustration led to his decision to communicate directly with the public through a detailed manifesto explaining his philosophy and goals. In 1995, Kaczynski sent copies of his 35,000-word manifesto, titled Industrial Society and Its Future, to major newspapers and promised to end his bombing campaign if the document was published in full. The manifesto represented years of philosophical development and revealed the intellectual framework that Kaczynski believed justified his violent actions. The document argued that technological progress was fundamentally incompatible with human freedom and psychological well-being. Kaczynski contended that industrial society had created systems of control that reduced humans to components in a larger technological machine, destroying their autonomy and dignity in the process. The manifesto demonstrated Kaczynski's sophisticated understanding of psychology, sociology, and political theory. He drew on a wide range of academic sources to support his arguments and presented his ideas in a logical, systematic manner that belied the popular image of terrorist writings as incoherent rants. However, the manifesto also revealed the depth of Kaczynski's misanthropy and his willingness to justify violence in service of his ideology. He argued that the destruction of industrial society was necessary to preserve human freedom, even if such destruction required the deaths of millions of people through economic collapse and social chaos. The decision by the New York Times and the Washington Post to publish the manifesto in September 1995 was controversial and reflected the difficult balance between public safety and editorial principles. Law enforcement officials hoped that publication might lead to tips from readers who recognized the writing style or ideas, while editors grappled with the ethical implications of providing a platform for terrorist propaganda. The publication of the Unabomber Manifesto had exactly the effect that law enforcement had hoped for, but in a way that no one could have predicted. David Kaczynski, Ted's younger brother, recognized both the writing style and the philosophical arguments as unmistakably similar to letters he had received from his brother over the years. David Kaczynski faced an agonizing decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The evidence strongly suggested that his brother was responsible for a 17-year campaign of terrorism that had killed 3 people and injured many others. However, reporting his suspicions to the FBI would likely result in his brother's arrest and possible execution. The decision was made more complicated by David's genuine love for his brother and his memories of Ted as a brilliant, if troubled, individual who had once shown promise of contributing positively to society. The transformation from accomplished mathematician to domestic terrorist seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet the evidence was undeniable. After months of agonizing deliberation and consultation with his wife and a private investigator, David Kaczynski made the decision to contact the FBI with his suspicions. This decision was motivated not only by civic duty, but also by the hope that cooperation might help his brother avoid the death penalty if he were indeed the Unabomber. The information provided by David Kaczynski gave investigators the break they had been seeking for nearly 2 decades. For the first time, they had a credible suspect with a known location and a clear connection to the manifesto that had defined the Unabomber's ideology. The investigation could now focus on gathering evidence to confirm what seemed increasingly certain, that Theodore Kaczynski was the elusive domestic terrorist they had been hunting for so long. On April 3, 1996, FBI agents surrounded Theodore Kaczynski's remote cabin near Lincoln, Montana. The arrest was conducted carefully, as investigators were aware that the cabin might contain additional bombs or booby traps. However, Kaczynski offered no resistance and was taken into custody without incident. The search of Kaczynski's cabin revealed a treasure trove of evidence that confirmed his identity as the Unabomber. Investigators found bomb-making materials, partially completed explosive devices, and detailed notes describing the construction and deployment of bombs used in the campaign. The cabin essentially served as a museum of the Unabomber's 17-year reign of terror. Perhaps most significantly, investigators discovered the original typewriter used to write the Unabomber manifesto, along with multiple drafts and research materials that clearly linked Kaczynski to the document. They also found extensive journals in which Kaczynski had recorded his thoughts and plans, providing unprecedented insight into the mind of a domestic terrorist. The physical evidence found in the cabin was supplemented by forensic analysis that connected materials in Kaczynski's possession to components used in the bombs. Wood from trees on his property matched materials used in several devices, and chemical analysis linked substances found in the cabin to explosive compounds used in the attacks. Kaczynski's arrest was met with relief by law enforcement officials who had worked on the case for nearly 2 decades. The investigation had consumed enormous resources and had frustrated agents who watched the bombing campaign continue despite their best efforts. The capture of the Unabomber represented one of the most significant victories in the FBI's fight against domestic terrorism. Theodore Kaczynski's trial began in 1997 and was closely watched by the media and the public. The case presented unique legal challenges, as Kaczynski's obvious guilt was complicated by questions about his mental state and his desire to represent himself in court despite his lack of legal training. Kaczynski's insistence on representing himself stemmed from his rejection of his lawyer's strategy of arguing that he was mentally ill. He preferred to use the trial as a platform for articulating his anti-technology philosophy, even if doing so made his conviction more likely. This decision reflected his continued belief in the importance of his ideological message over his personal survival. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of Kaczynski's guilt, including the physical evidence from his cabin, forensic connections between materials in his possession and the bombs, and testimony from handwriting experts who confirmed his authorship of the manifesto and various threatening letters. The defense team's efforts to portray Kaczynski as mentally ill were undermined by his obvious intelligence and the methodical nature of his crimes. While experts testified about his antisocial personality disorder and possible paranoid schizophrenia, the carefully planned and executed nature of his bombing campaign suggested a rational, if twisted, mind at work. Ultimately, Kaczynski accepted a plea agreement that sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The agreement also required him to pay restitution to his victims and to cooperate with ongoing investigations into any additional crimes he might have committed. The case of Theodore Kaczynski remains one of the most complex and troubling examples of domestic terrorism in American history. His transformation from brilliant mathematician to deadly terrorist raises profound questions about the relationship between genius and madness, isolation and violence, and ideology and action. Kaczynski's critique of technological society, while expressed through horrific violence, has found resonance among some environmental and anti-globalization activists who see him as a martyr for the cause of preserving human autonomy in an increasingly mechanized world. However, his methods have been universally condemned, and his legacy serves more as a cautionary tale than an inspirational example. The investigation into the Unabomber case led to significant advances in forensic science, behavioral analysis, and interagency cooperation. The techniques developed during the 17-year manhunt have been applied to other cases of domestic and international terrorism, contributing to law enforcement's ability to identify and capture elusive criminals. Perhaps most importantly, the Kaczynski case highlighted the potential for highly intelligent individuals to use their abilities in destructive ways when they become disconnected from the social bonds that typically channel human energy toward positive goals. His story serves as a reminder of the importance of mental health support, social connection, and constructive outlets for intellectual and emotional energy. The victims of Kaczynski's campaign, Hugh Scruton, Thomas Mosser, Gilbert Murray, and the 23 individuals who were injured, represent the human cost of ideological extremism. Their deaths and injuries were not abstractions in support of a philosophical argument, but real tragedies that destroyed lives and devastated families. Today, Theodore Kaczynski remains imprisoned at ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Colorado, where he continues to write and correspond with supporters and scholars interested in his case. His story continues to fascinate researchers studying the psychology of terrorism, the relationship between intelligence and violence, and the social factors that can transform productive citizens into dangerous criminals. The cabin where Kaczynski lived and planned his attacks has been moved to the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, where it serves as a training tool for agents studying domestic terrorism. The structure stands as a physical reminder of how isolation, intelligence, and extremist ideology can combine to create threats to public safety that can persist for decades before being resolved. In the quiet darkness of a Montana wilderness, a brilliant mind turned to darkness, creating ripples of terror that spread across a nation. The story of the Unabomber reminds us that the greatest threats sometimes come not from obvious enemies, but from the shadows of our own society, where intelligence without empathy can become a weapon against the very civilization that nurtured it. Sleep peacefully knowing that vigilance and cooperation can eventually bring even the most elusive criminals to justice. So close your eyes, let the hush of the night wrap around you, and know this: some stories don't end. They drift. They dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.